All right. So Jim, it's something I just thinking about when we were planning this last week, actually, before sadly our country has taken an agonizing few days. And then, I don't want to dwell on this, but we should acknowledge the world in which we're living right now. I was on a run actually yesterday and listening to a podcast that's been this brilliant podcast that Steve Kerr and Pete Carroll are doing together. And it's a pandemic creation. And they had Michael Lewis, the author, on. Yeah. Michael Lewis is doing a whole series right now about the value of coaching. And he said something that was, Steve Kerr actually said, my jaw dropped. Michael Lewis said, I look at America right now, our country, like we're a really talented group with a lot of potential, but very poorly coached. And Steve Kerr said, my jaw dropped. And it's hard to watch, just what we've seen around our country this weekend. And boy, that line resonated when I heard that.
Yeah, I mean, Steve Kerr is such an interesting guy. His background, I think, is very fascinating. It's now widely known. He was in Beirut. His father was assassinated for his views over there. He has a deep political background, Steve. He's certainly not just an athlete, not just a coach. He's a very well-rounded, well thought out, well-spoken person. It's really interesting to hear him weigh in when we have these upheavals, which are sadly more and more often these days. Obviously, we've had social unrest throughout the years, but it's come to a point right now, which is understandable. And you need to hear smart voices. I was watching CNBC this morning. They had a lot of really interesting leaders on, business leaders. So there's a gentleman who runs Merck, who's very central to the vaccine efforts right now. He's the CEO of Merck, happens to be African-American as well. So he came on to talk about another issue after having talked about the vaccine last week, and just incredibly thoughtful and passionate and impassioned. And that's the moment we find ourselves in, right, Ted? It's a moment of reckoning for, I think, all of us, and leadership matters. And while the traditional leadership we've come to expect may not be, the typical leadership that we've had in these moments, I think it's fair to say. I mean, I thought we probably should have heard from the president on a national address by now on something this important, and we haven't. So other leaders have to step in to fill that void. And I think that's probably what Steve's referring to.
Yeah, I think, exactly. And the talented author, Michael Lewis. So I think we just say that as an acknowledgement. Okay, we're not in a vacuum here. But we also understand sport, even though we don't have the live sport right now, a distraction. And I know, Jim, you've even done this. I purposely, when we decided to do this, I don't want to, I feel like I've spent 11 weeks reliving, right? That's what sports has been about. And I've watched more, sadly, or listened to more of myself from old matches over the last 11 weeks. It's just like, I cringe now when I put one of those, especially the old SD, like 2000, 2001, 2002 tapes that NBC's been showing, and it's the squeezed screen because it's not HD. So what I wanted to do with you is just talk really, look, you're a two-time champion, you've been a great player, but more about today. So anyway, where I thought I'd start is I started in tennis when you were coming through the ranks and making your way. And I used to hear the phrase all the time, he or she is a clay courter. And I wonder today, are there still clay courters, or are there players who play well on clay?
Well, I mean, I think there certainly are players who you would deem clay courters because that's where they make the bulk of their points. That's where they're most comfortable and confident. And they're certainly, they would prefer their whole season would be on clay if they could have it that way. So I think from that standpoint, yes. But what I do think has changed, just with the speed of the game, like every other sport, tennis has increased in pace and power over the years. The athletes are bigger, stronger, faster, and the equipment has moved as well. So what I think has changed is that stylistically, people don't play as different on a clay court as they used to compared to the other surfaces. I think more players these days play at a very similar style across surfaces, and the surfaces and the balls the combinations, they have come closer together as well to allow that to happen. Whereas on clay, it used to, you would play a very different style. You would moonball or loop the ball in different ways back, in the 70s and 80s. It's changed a lot. I mean, we're not going back, I don't believe, to the type of final we saw with Matt Wielander and Yvonne Lendl, if you can remember way back there, where it literally was, they were moonballing, having 30, 40 shot rallies. You won't see that, I don't think, going forward, because the mentality, as much as anything else, has also changed too. So no, I don't know that it's. I don't think we can really go back to quite that much of a surface specific mindset unless they slow the courts down and slow the balls down on the clay, speed them up, and make the bounces more regular on the grass and lighter balls. So I think unless you expand the differences, that's what I see as much as anything, is just that the surfaces and the balls have made everything almost the same except for the movement.
I think that's the first time I've heard Yvonne Lendl and moonball used in the same sentence. That is good.
Watch the match. It was mind-boggling to watch at the time, because they could both hit the ball hard if they wanted to. But yeah, Matt's was just up in the air, and Yvonne was, all right, I'll go as long as you want.
You have been one of the people that has challenged my theory, because I've always maintained that Beresetegi was a myth. There was no such thing as Beresetegi, because I never saw him. He was
playing that backhand like that?
Well, yeah, he was playing before I was involved in broadcasting the French Open.
Yeah.
And I don't think he ever played in the States while I was basically just doing the Open then. So I thought this guy's just a creation, and I've heard the stories about the weirdness of the shots and all that stuff. You tell me he actually did exist.
Oh, there's no doubt he existed. He beat me in the finals of Nice one year. I mean, he was a surface specialist.
Yeah.
But that guy had one of the funkiest backhands, and I am a connoisseur of funky backhands, because mine certainly is as well. But he used the same side of the racket as his forehand. He would just flip it over like a windshield wiper and hit it that way. He was a beast of a mover, Ted. He did exist, but he was so fast you almost couldn't see him.
That's interesting. So moving, well, let me just ask you these things about clay. Is the clay different today than it was when you were playing on it 25, 30 years ago? So not like Wimbledon where the surface has changed. It's the same surface.
You would not want to touch the Roland Garros clay and make it at all any different. What makes it different than some of the other red clay courts that you would play on is that it is so firm underneath. They have the crushed limestone underneath as the base before they put the layers of clay on top of it, the crushed brick. And on a lot of clay courts, players, when they're serving, they drag their toe in the process of the motion, like a baseball pitcher, like a Tom Seaver would drag his foot through. You drag that almost like a rudder. And on a clay court, you can dig a little trench there if it's not firm enough. And you would need a jackhammer to dig a trench in the Roland Garros clay. It's so hard, but then it's so silky and smooth too. It's very powdery. It's not as coarse as some of the other clay courts in Europe are. It's really spectacular and special.
As I'm watching now, it looks to me like the players move fabulously. Do they move? You mentioned Beresetegi. Do the players, do they move as well as they did in the days when there were, let's say, clay quarters?
Well, I think everyone has had to be faster, because the ball's coming at you faster. And I think the athletes, we've seen, like other sports, the average size of the athlete has grown immensely in both men's and women's tennis. I'd say on average about 3 inches to 4 inches of height on average difference in the last 30 years between the top 100 players. But the difference, we started to see this in my time on tour. You started to see tall players who could move. That did not used to be the case in tennis. You used to be either small and speedy or tall and powerful and slow. And then you had breakthrough players like Marat Safin at 6'4" who could move as well as a 5'10" guy. And now we see that is de rigueur. There are plenty of guys at that size who move incredibly well. So speed is definitely a factor. Athletes, I think they're better conditioned. They train better. They recover better. They use the science and the technology and all that and the expertise. but there were always great movers. Bjorn was an incredible mover. There are so many phenomenal athletes that came through our sport. It's just that the size has changed.
Yeah.
And when the ball's coming at you as fast as it comes these days with as much spin, you need to be athletic to be able to stay in points, and they certainly are.
What you've seen him all now for the 12 years that he's won. What to you is there one thing that still, when you see Rafa on, especially Chatrier,
Yeah.
is there something about Rafa where you just still shake your head and you go, "This is extraordinary"?
Yeah, but it changes, Ted. I mean, you've been there. I mean, I missed some of them. I was watching your call on TV for a lot of those early in his run before I started going back over. He is adapted. He doesn't play in the same areas of the court all the time that he did when he started. This return to serve position has gotten deeper and deeper over the years, but he still gets right back up to the baseline after a shot or two and gets into normal patterns of play from there. But he's become a better player. He's had to, because the other players have gotten better and pushed him as well, but they haven't pushed him off of his pedestal there. It's mind-blowing that he's been able to stay in there mentally the way that he has, because so many of our game's great players, think of someone like Borg, who was so dominant on that surface and so focused and concentrated, just ran out of emotional energy and left the sport effectively. And Rafa, every point, he never takes a point off. Have you ever seen anything like it in tennis? In men's tennis anyway?
No, he's the Pete. I say he's the Pete Rose, because that's the thing I've always heard from people who played with Pete Rose, was no matter score, time of year, he never gave an at-bat away, ever.
Yeah. And I think a lot of us, I'm sure you have as well, riveted by getting some insight into what has made Michael Jordan tick, and seeing his intensity in the practice court and how relentless his pursuit of perfection is. And Nadal is just another one of those athletes who has that relentless mindset. And when you combine that with his skill set on the court, and then the best of 5 component at Roland Garros, you have this nearly invincible concoction, because he just takes the legs out from his opponents a lot of the time, but he also just takes the hope away, because they're not used to matching that intensity, because they don't do it in their own day-to-day existence. So they have to lift to him, and that's intimidating. And you have to try and do it consistently for possibly 5 hours. And many have tried, 90-something have tried, and only 2 have succeeded.
Jimmy, you brought up the return position with Nadal, which we've seen over the years, and especially on Chatrier, which has a massive amount of space on the playing surface. And we even saw it now. We called the semifinal last year, Roger and Rafa at Wimbledon, and Rafa was was returning back close to the lines people on the very lush green grass. We even saw Djokovic start doing that. My point is, it's bled into other things. I still am blown away, never having played at the level you guys played at. How can Rafa play from where he plays from, particularly in Paris, and never be hurt by short ball, drop shot, whatever, funk ball, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah. Well, a couple reasons. First, he does when he stands back in the court, he's buying himself time to be more offensive on the returns. And when he's able to get good stick on the ball, he makes it very tough for you to hit the drop shot. Especially if he's hitting a forehand, and that ball has so much rotation on it, comes up and bounces into you, to perfectly time that and to take power off of that shot and that finesse is not easy. It's much easier to do off of a flat ball from my history in playing. And I've never hit balls with Rafa, but I've watched him enough to have a pretty good idea of how severe it must be to deal with. So, and he's not slow. And he's also, the second he hits that return to serve, he is moving in a diagonal. Unless he's hit a weak return, he's moving in a diagonal back towards the baseline. So he's moving forward, and he will see you change. If this is your racket head, he will see you change your grip to a volley grip, which is what most players hit drop shots with from their normal grip. And he'll have anticipation on that, and he'll have momentum. So it takes a pretty good combination. Not that it can't be done, and it certainly needs to be tried, just because why not? You're going to lose anyway. But he's coming forward. he has eyes on you and he's pushing you back a lot of the time. So it just makes it more challenging for players to do that.
I think I've told this story to you before. You referenced the spin, and this was some years ago, and it was one of those eye-opening moments for people like me who don't ever get this, again, firsthand thing. But Djokovic at one point hired Mark Woodford, and this is probably 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
He hires Mark Woodford to help him volley. So I see Woodford, I think it was at Roland Garros, and hey, how'd this go with Novak? Novak seems like this very open-minded guy. He's continually asking for others to come in and help him improve his game. And he goes, well, Novak's talented. He can volley, but I've told him not Rafa. And I said, really? He goes, the spin on Rafa's ball, way too hard. He said, I would not want to volley because of what you talked about. And this was 10 years ago when we were still learning all this, the things that now you pointed out that Hawkeye can quantify for us. At the time, it was just a visual, right?
Yeah.
And I'll never forget Woodford saying that, not against Rafa.
Yeah, it's one of the things that also makes him arguably the best doubles player in the world when he plays, is who can volley against this guy. And you don't want to be in baseline exchanges with him necessarily either. So, the ball is coming hard and fast and diving when it comes from his forehand. That's a pretty tough combination for a volleyer. So, yeah, I mean, if you can get it on his backhand, that's your play. And that's what Novak's play is. We've, laid out countless times when we've worked together about how Novak tries to drive the ball cross court with his backhand, open Rafa up to the forehand so he can then attack the backhand and get to the net to finish points if he can. You just don't want to be coming in on that forehand at all because it's tennis's version of kamikaze. It's just not a good idea.
Because he doesn't have to, Jim, and I've wondered this, and again, this is where we've come to when it comes to this conversation, Nadal and Roland Garros, is we are dealing with Superman, and everyone's looking, there must be some kryptonite somewhere. And because Rafa only plays probably one match a year on the second court, Longland, which has less playing surface, would that matter if he had to play more matches on Longland?
Not really. I mean, I think in certain scenarios against certain players, it might impact him just a little bit. I mean, the width of that court is a bit, it's a little tighter.
Yeah.
Chatrier as well. So for him on the return of serves, if someone's swinging him wide with a slice serve or hitting a kick serve, he might have problems using the angles that he's been deploying very successfully in recent years. But ultimately, Rafa is such an amazing problem solver too. I don't know that. I mean, other than really Novak, I'm pretty convinced if Rafa plays his best, there's no one that can beat him. I think if Novak plays his best on red clay and Rafa plays his best on red clay in a neutral day when it's not like crazy windy or anything like that, I think Novak beats him probably more than he loses, to be honest.
Really?
But playing your best is no given for anyone. But Rafa certainly and Novak know how to do it more than most.
Yeah. Well,
what about you? You think that Team obviously has been amazing and he's lifted his game this year in Australia. We saw that. Do you think Team is a guy at his best in 2020 who could take Rafa on the clay?
No, not. I wish I would say that, but only because he's had the chances and he just Team, as we saw in the finals in Melbourne before the virus struck. He's right there. He has a chance to win a match, to win a major, as Djokovic down, and Novak was able to come back and spin that match his way. So yeah, I wish I would say that. The only thing, the one time I remember really feeling Rafa was vulnerable and that I think he bailed at Roland Garros was the final with Djokovic where Rafa stopped playing because it was raining.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
and it rained. I mean,
there was the ball at the umpire because the balls were super heavy with the rain.
And look, he was right in that the conditions weren't very good, but they hadn't been good. And in baseball, again, this is a lot of my background, as you know, Jim. In baseball, and I remember talking on the air with Mac and Mary Carrillo that day about this. In baseball, the rule of thumb was once the game started, if it was light rain or whatever, it really had to rain to stop once you start because you've been willing to play in this condition right? Well, that's what happened this day. They'd played for 2+ hours in that stuff.
Yep.
And Rafa had been kicking Novak's tail. And then suddenly Novak again spun, and now Novak is getting the better of it. And I, to this day, will believe that's why Rafa just said, wait a minute, I'm not going down this way.
Yeah.
We'll come back and finish tomorrow. And they did, and Rafa kicked his butt. But that's the only time I've ever really felt that Rafa was vulnerable. And I'm assuming it was conditions.
Yeah, it definitely was conditions. I was calling that match for another network, and it definitely it was the weight of the ball. Rafa couldn't get the ball to react because it had gotten so much rain on it that they were just heavier, and his ball wasn't getting up and out of Novak's comfort zone. And Novak is able to hit through the court in those conditions a little bit easier with his flatter swing. So yeah, I'll never forget, Rafa takes a ball and throws it in anger at the chair umpire to say, you go play with these things. These are, they're like watermelons now. They're too heavy. You can't do this. And next thing you know, the match is suspended in a dry day. Rafa's ball starts working. And we saw some of that also with Diego Schwartzman a couple of years ago when Schwartzman was playing him in a heavy day and in the same conditions. Rafa couldn't get the ball high enough on Schwartzman, and Schwartzman was just pounding him, out hitting him. And Rafa started to turn the match around a little bit before they canceled it for the day. And then the next day it was hot and dry, and Rafa's ball jumped about 8 inches higher, and that was the end of it.
No, that's good memory, Jim, because I said I've called the 2 matches that he's lost. The Soderling match, which we now subsequently found out, look, he was going through the issue with his parents splitting, and it was a domestic thing that was tearing him up, and he was impacted by that. Then the other match, and I forget which year it was, but Novak just crushed him. And it was one of the very few times I've ever seen Rafa Nadal lose his body language on the court, because he knew he was getting his butt kicked. It wasn't even close, and you'd see him go to the chair and like that, which are the kind of thing you never see Rafa ever do that. So I kind of put those two. Those are the anomalies to me. You put them away, and the Schwartzman one is another good memory of one of the few times where Rafa really got threatened, because Rogers never, 6 times I think now. Rogers won sets here and there, but he's never really been in a position, I thought, where you thought he could win that match.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And if you look at, and we've all looked at Rafa's, the matches he's played over the years. So few players have taken him to 5 sets in tournaments that he's won. Isner did it one year in the first round. But again, Rafa up early in the 5th set and kind of runs away with it. There are just so few times that any of us who've had the luxury of getting to watch it up close have thought, oh, he actually might lose this thing. And that's just amazing when you put that into context. So this is a guy who he just doesn't come close to losing these tournaments that are pretty hard to win.
I was somebody, and I'm trying to find this gentleman's name, and I can't right now, so I apologize. But somebody sent a question in on social, which goes now, and it's the classic, great bar conversation for tennis: Borg against Rafa at Roland Garros. Borg lost 2 matches to the same guy. Rafa lost 2 matches to 2 different people. And which one would make it